Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Birmingham. Thank you for being here today. This is the AAA Program Data Reporting for fiscal year 25-26 webinar. And if you don't know me, I've got a quick little introduction to myself slide. So again, my name's Dan Birmingham. I'm the data manager specialist on the team. Been with CDA about 6 years, area agency on aging. Prior to that, for about 4.5 years. So I've been doing this for a while now and enjoying every day of it. I'm on the planning, monitoring, and data section data team, and we're responsible for the data collection and reporting for Older Americans Act, Older Californians Act programs and services, as well as some of these other federal and state supplemental ones, such as the home and community-based services, public health workforce, the variety of COVID-19 supplemental relief funds, such as CARES, American Rescue Plan, things like that. I do have some other colleagues on the line too, and Jamie Pope, the chief of our data planning monitoring data section, is here helping me out with the webinar, checking out chat and questions in that. So thank you, Jamie, for being here to support the webinar today. And there's other from CDA here as well to support as needed. So I like to start all of my webinars, or most of them, with this slide here. And someone recently asked me, "Why, Dan? Why do you include this question? How does it go along with the content they're going to share?" Which is great. I appreciate that question because it helps remind myself why I put it here, and it gives me some time to reflect again on why. So this is the Older Americans Act Declaration of Objectives. It's in the very beginning of the Older Americans Act. I have it paraphrased here to fit it all into one slide, but again, very quickly. So in the OAA, Congress declares that the older people of our nation are entitled to, and it's a joint duty and responsibility of the governments of the United States to assist our older people to secure equal opportunity to the full and free enjoyment of the following. And those are the things that's listed there. I have this in here because it helps me. I hope it also helps you to ground the data reporting that we do. Otherwise, sometimes it feels like, well, there's no purpose, or it becomes mundane, or we just do it because someone told us to do it. So that's why I like to have this in here, because it helps us ground some of the work that we do, in addition to CDA's vision, mission, objectives, strategy, strategic plan, the master plan, all those things, including your own local organizations, visions, missions, strategic plans. All that put together is why we do the data collection reporting. So it has real meaning and value. And last thing too, if you have not read the Older Americans Act yet, I do encourage everyone that does any sort of Older Americans Act work that's here with data collection reporting or anything else, please become familiar with the Older Americans Act. I believe it would benefit you. Okay. So on that note, we are seeking public comment, CDA seeking public comment on the newest version of the Older Americans Act state plan. So every state unit on aging needs to do a state plan. So we have the draft of the 2025-2029 4-year state plan is available at that website. And of course, again, the links and stuff, the PDF is in the chat here, and then it's also going to be sent out and available to you later on to click on those links. So we are asking for public comment from everyone. The survey for public comment will close on June 21st. So please get those comments in by then. And you can also email any comments or questions regarding the state plan to that email address, oaastateplan@aging.ca.gov. Next little thing to start with here too, related to data, is the CHARM project. CHARM project has been going for a few years now, but it is very exciting. That stands for the Customer Holistic Aging Relationship Management Project. So that's something that CDA has been undertaking, as I said, for a few years now, with the goal of getting some sort of statewide uh, service delivery, data collection, and reporting system that the whole state would be able to use and leverage. Big project, as you can imagine. We have made some progress on it. So I want to highlight that tomorrow we are doing a Charm Project Progress Updates Phase 1 Summary Results webinar. That's tomorrow at 2 o'clock. There's a link there to register for it. Again, you can get that link in the PDF that we're dropping into the chat, or we'll also send it out, try to send it out later today or tomorrow once the recording's available. But if you need it prior to then, please always feel free to reach out to us at the data team, or there's the Charm Project email addresses there too, charmproject@agent.ca.gov. Okay, into the content of the webinar today. So we recently, last week, sent out a program memo communicating some reporting reminders as well as some revised reporting requirements for the upcoming fiscal year. So that's program memo 25-03, and then there's a couple attachments on there as well, which is the CAR specifications document, the data dictionary document, and the intake and assessment guide document there too. And at the moment, you can find it on the program memos webpage. So it's all there. And that's the content that's what we're going to be using for the content today. In addition to that, I also am going to be speaking to the SOGI and race data collection and reporting. I know it's been on a lot of people's minds, including myself and CDA. So I'll also be addressing that as well at the end, and then pointing out a couple additional resources and time. Okay. Excuse me. ODRT reminders. So that's the online data reporting tool. That's a web-based tool that CDA uses. We use for what we call the supplemental or not area plan funds. So that's such as like American Rescue Plan Act or Californians Act, and so on and so forth. Anything that's not area plan that we're collecting program data for, we're using the ODRT or online data reporting tool. A couple reminders here. So those do need to match the budgets and allocations that are on file with the CDA finance team. And by that, we mean anything that's approved by the finance team or those sorts of things. If you have funding, expenditures and things that you're reporting to the finance team for those things, we also need to have program data reported in the online data reporting tool, and vice versa. If you're reporting it in the program data in the online data reporting tool, please also make sure that you're doing your fiscal reporting and that you're overall working with your fiscal experts, analysts, managers, teams, to have accurate reporting on both sides, the program data stuff and the expenditures and fiscal stuff. If you need any reports that you don't have that say that you are reporting things into, or that your fiscal team is reporting for a certain reports, certain supplemental reports, let's say agent in place at the moment within the OCA modernization funds, and that report's not showing up for you in the online data reporting tool, please contact us, let us know, and we can make sure we get that available to you. I also want to point out that you have your ability to run your own reports. So if you do have access to a certain report within the online data reporting tool, you should be able to run your own reports too. So if you need to see data from a previous report that you made or something like that, I just wanted to point that out that you do have that ability and give that a try. And if you have any questions, please let us know. OCA modernization. So specifically some stuff regarding Old Californians Act modernization in the online data reporting tool. So reports are needed for each program funded within it, such as, again, agent in place, linkages, groceries. There's a whole menu, if you will, for those different services. So if those are being funded, please, you also need to be doing program data reports for each of those within the online data reporting tool. Now, the reminder, it must match what's revised and approved by the CDA finance team. And again, a reminder, I think I already mentioned it, but it is important. Generally, if there are program expenditures that's being reported to the finance team, we are also needing program data to go along with it. Um, so please keep that in mind, working with your fiscal teams too. If there is being program expenditures that are being sent and reported to CDA, we also need to have program data to go along with that. So this is the home and community-based services online data reporting tool reports. So as most of you know, that did end earlier in the program year. Um, so we will be working on a final data report to be used for that because our reporting wasn't initially built to handle a closure of a program mid-year. So we're working on having that end of year report so that we're all clear about what is the end data for the HCDS funded programs that we can use for our reporting for this current fiscal year that we're in and is almost over. And so that would represent programs and services provided with that funding from July 2024 through December 2024. So that, again, it'll be due sometime in July. We'll have that available to you. Excuse me, it'll be available sometime in July and due by the end of the month, please, as it usually is for our reports. And yeah, and that'll be a final data report for that program funding. A couple reminders here for American Rescue Plan. So for fiscal year 25-26, I switched it to be annual only. We did that because it was getting to be challenging to know which report was which in terms of what data to count and which one was the most true and representative. I know there was challenges with cumulative reporting and things of that nature. So to an attempt to simplify it a little bit more for this year of reporting, we haven't been receiving or allowing. We turned off the American Rescue Plan report, so some of you have noticed that, and I appreciate that. But it'll be just an annual report for this year. So that'll be available and due in October, which of course the American Rescue Plan is on the federal funding cycle, federal reporting cycle. So that ends in September and the report will be due in October. And so summed up here, report represents all programs and services funded by the American Rescue Plan from October 2024, September 2025. Also, I think I have it on here, but something else that's important with American Rescue Plan, if anything else in the online data reporting tool, if it is asking for expenditures, that is because we do need those expenditures. Yes, in some cases, or in all cases, yes, you are reporting expenditures to the finance team, but it's not always in the same program reporting year or same timeline or due date that we need it for program data reporting. So that's why it's there. It's because we need it. If we don't have that, then we're reporting the programs and services that were delivered, but no funding to go along with it and vice versa. So that's why we stress it often that we need both. If we don't have both, then we're not really submitting a complete report on the programs and services being delivered versus the expenditures to go along with that. If we don't have both, it's not complete. All right. data reporting guidance updates. So this is what I was referring to with the program memo and the three documents. These are, if you will, the big three documents for program data reporting. And so relatively minor changes, mostly clarity and things like that. Don't believe we're not asking for any new data reporting with these updates. So, but some things I wanted to highlight. So the unit measure in the data dictionary, there was a 1 before every single unit measure. And we took a look at that, did a data analysis of it, did a deep dive into it, and determined that it was just causing more confusion than it needed to be. So we removed the 1 from all of the data, all the figures in the data dictionary. So all the unit measures are remaining, or most of them, except for the couple that I highlighted next. Most of them remain the same, but we removed the 1 from of each of those in the data dictionary. And a note on that too. So this is especially helpful, this change for those service categories that use time as a unit measure, such as hour. So those service categories that use unit measures such as hour, to help to clarify some of that too. So let's say, for example, that in Homemaker, a participant received 2.5 units, 2.5 service units of that service category, that the quantity of that would be reported as 2.5, not 2.3, such as like 2.5 hours, or 150, such as 150 minutes. That's not accurate reporting for this. It's a fraction against the unit measure. So if it's 2.5 service units, you would report 2.5. If it was 2 3/4, then 2.75, so on and so forth. But please keep that in mind to get the most accurate reporting for those unit measures that use time, such as hour. Let's see. So, and then we did make some changes, some updates to the unit measure for health promotion and a couple of, so health promotion, we changed it from contact to session. Again, that was something that we felt would help to clarify that that service category, or excuse me, the unit measure for that service category. So we did make that change. We also made a change to the supplemental services lead consultation, change that from contact to hour to be consistent with the 3B legal services unit measure. So now those unit measures are the same. However, always keep in mind that 3E supplemental services legal consultation and 3B legal assistance are not the same program. They have different requirements and different things. They're similar in a lot of ways, but they're not the same. So it's something to keep in mind. But we did make that update to try to help smooth that out a little bit and clarify that service. We also, I don't have it on the slide, but we did have in nutrition education, there's no change to it, but the nutrition team did add an example of how to report the units. And so another example of a clarifying thing that we added to the data dictionary. So of course, we do encourage you to take a look at that. And if you have any questions, please send us a message and we'll address those. All right. Moving right along. So I wanted to spend a little time, this is not in the program memo, but I wanted to spend a little time to address SOGI's data collection reporting, as well as race and ethnicity, covering that next. So of course, that stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and SC is new, that stands for sex characteristics. So for SOGI, this is a state of California state mandated data collection around 2018. And that's, of course, voluntary and self-reported, like all the data is for Older Americans Act programs. It's all voluntary and self-reported. And so that added in 2018. So we've been collecting it since then. There have been a variety of legislation and other things that have amended and changed it the past few years. It's expanded which departments in the state are required to also collect it and things like that. But most recently in 2023, there was the legislation that year of AB 1163 was the number for that year in 2023, expanded for sex characteristics and intersexuality, which we don't collect. And that's where the sex characteristics come from. So that is something that we will need to eventually modify our data collection to include that in our SOGI SC data collection. We still have another year to be in compliance with that. And that's also the government code there. If you're interested, the government code, state of California, that's what we're referring to. But we need to have a little bit we need to have a little bit more time to do some further research, collaboration, and training to inform not just the addition of collection of the sex characteristics and intersexuality, but also to look at the data questions and responses that we have that we've been using for years now. Take a look at those and spend some real time and intention to make sure that it's meeting the purpose that it's meant to be for, and that it's collecting things accurately and those sorts of things. Also looking into providing additional training and support to the AAAs that are and their contracted service providers that are collecting this, providing training on and support on how to collect these things in a inclusive and culturally sensitive way and things like that, a person-centered way. So we'll also be working on that. So no changes now for that, but we do anticipate that to be changed next year for state reporting requirements. And this continues to be something that is important for the state of California and CDA to collect and serve that community population. The next thing here is race and ethnicity. This was something else that did get an update at the federal level in 2024. So last year got an update. It hasn't been updated since 1997. So it was updated. It's also known as the SPD 15 or the Statistical Policy Directive 15, and that's the federal standard for collecting race and ethnicity and demographic data. And some of the highlights of what that update did, it combines race and ethnicity into one question, and it's continuing to be, there's a question for race and there's a question for ethnicity, and those are treated separate. This revised guidance or directive now combines it into one. It also expanded what they call the minimum race ethnicity categories to include Middle Eastern or North African as an option. So that's something else that'll be as a change. Now in the federal policy directive, it orders everyone to have compliance by July 2028. So we still have some time. We were hoping to be able to implement something like that now or soon, but again, that still needs some more work and intention to make sure that we're making those changes in a meaningful and useful way for everyone. You as our AAA partners, as well as the people that we serve. So there's also I wanted to point out, there is a state bill going through right now as we speak. It's AB 1186, and that amends the government code to also recognize the SPD 15, so that it requires all the state departments within California to be using the 2024 Statistical Policy Directive, combining race and ethnicity into one question, adding in these minimum race categories and things like that. So it's still pending. It hasn't passed or finished up yet, but it's just something to be aware of, that could be complementing the federal SPD 15 at the federal level, and then the state level would complement that. So just something to be aware of. But again, at this time, we're not making any changes to the race and ethnicity questions and responses for CDA's data collection and reporting requirements. Hopefully, that's something we can get together next year, but 2028 by the latest. But that is something that we would like to have done sooner if we can, but it's not happening. A couple additional resources to point out, if you're not already aware, or a reminder if you are, the CDA website has all sorts of different resources and things there for you to look at and use to support you for data collection and reporting. And then there's also, I have a YouTube playlist that has all these, this recording will be there. That's where you'll find the recording. And then any past recordings are also there for your use as well. And please encourage your colleagues, if someone couldn't make it, they can find the recording there once it's available for this presentation. So I think I already said it, but just another reminder, just in case, the presentation recordings will be sent for your information. You can always request it from the data team at any time. Thank you for all that you do. And now I'll have we've got plenty of time for questions now. So I'll do that pretty quickly. Before questions, I don't think I said it, but I also want to acknowledge that, as always, that having these sorts of revisions this late in the game, let's say, close to July, close to a new fiscal year, is challenging and difficult for making changes to your contracts and things like that. So we do acknowledge that, apologize that it happened this late. But some of it's the unit measures changed. And so, please, some of the unit measures changed. So please do what you can to work with your providers on those changes to be up to date with the current changes, and then do your best to, adjust those contracts and things as soon as you can to be in compliance with these updated changes. Okay, questions? The chat, somebody. Amy, please kick us off. Go ahead.
Sorry, I've got bronchitis.
Oh no.
I know. So, okay, so we've got unit changes in 3E and 3D. Great. SOGI and race ethnicity changes are pending. Yes. So other than those two, obviously data has to match finance, and you let us know if those two things are not matching.
Yeah.
Are there any other changes that need to be implemented in July? I apologize if my brain is fuzzy. I just want to be able to be sure that I'm.
Yeah, I think you summed it up pretty well. I mean, those are the ones that I wanted to point out for revisions and reminders. So there is a summary of changes document at the end of the data dictionary.
Yeah.
So that will also point out any other updates or changes that we made. But I think you got it. I think we got it. I think that's mostly.
And then if there are fraction changes, they need to do that, and that's fine.
Yeah, the fraction thing's interesting. That's just come up recently, and timely. I got questions from one or two AAAs about it as well.
Yeah.
Specifically in terms of those unit measures or service categories that use hour for unit measure.
Oh, okay.
And so, and it historically it can lead to big data inaccuracies because there has been rounding being done within the car system. So some of you have experienced this, or maybe will be experiencing it, where you look at your CARS reports and the number is a lot bigger than what was in your local data system. Well, that was because most likely, in some cases, it could have been because of this rounding, where it's rounding up, or sometimes rounding. I'm still getting a firm grasp or understanding of what rounding is happening. But the goal of some of these improvements and changes that we're making with that is to, like, if we're going to round it, we don't round it to the very end. So, don't round it until you have your complete report done, and then we round it, not round it each individual time that we report a service unit, but we're rounding it at the end. So it's just trying to get a more accurate count of those services being delivered. Okay. Thank you, Amy. I hope you feel better soon. Next question.
Feel better, Amy. It's Jamie popping in here, Dan. We've got a few
Yeah.
questions in the chat.
Okay. I'll take a look.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see here. Okay, stated if there are expenditures, we also need to have program data. There are times when funds are going. So work with your fiscal team on it too. So this question's about, there's times when funds are going 100% to overhead or admin costs, so there's no program data. Well, again, work with us, work with the fiscal team. It's my understanding in the fiscal, there's program expenditures and admin expenditures. If you're reporting program expenditures, in most cases, there should be program data. If it's admin expenditures, there's no program data. But program expenditures, program data. I know there's always going to be exceptions here and there, but generally that is what we're trying to get to. If you're reporting the program expenditures, there should be program data to go along with it. Next question, where can we find the new data dictionary? So at the moment, it's on the program memo webpage. You can find it there as an attachment. And then this week, I'll be putting it on the data. There's a data planning or data reporting tab webpage in CDA as well. So we'll be putting it there too, but it's available now on the program memo webpage. You can download it there. What else we got here? ADRC data will continue to be reported to CDA separately and digitally. Yes, that's correct. ADRC data remains to be separate. We try to line it up as much as we can. We try to make sure that if we're asking it in two different places, we're at least asking the same thing. That's what we're trying to do. And then there's a lot of discussions as well as a department with the CA 2030 initiative. If you're not familiar with it, please ask your directors about that too. But there's a lot of work happening with that on how can we line up some of these things or combine some of these things. But at the moment, it's different. It's continue to be reported separately. Okay, county field need to be questioned in the intake assessment form. No, I don't. No, not necessarily. I don't believe it needs to be asked of it. It's just something that we're also now collecting. So if that's something that you can already get at with someone's address or something like that. But if you feel like that's not accurate, or if you need to have that as a required, or, something that you put on your intake form to gather that information, then please do so. But yes, you're right on. It does, and that's specifically it's for everybody, but especially those PSAs or planning and service areas that are multi-county. That helps us to start seeing our data within different counties and not just one big planning and service area. But not just that, I mean, it does benefit single PSAs as well, single county PSAs, because that helps to start gathering data to show, like, if someone lives in a different county and is receiving services in your PSA, it can help to start, looking and analyzing and being aware of that data too. Okay. And if at any time, if anyone has questions while I'm talking about your question, please, unmute yourself. You should be able to do that, and you can let me know. Next question here, Anna. Is there a reason why 3B and 3E data reporting is Uh, tell me more, Dan, what you're asking. Oh, you mean like update the unit measure updates? And
Yeah.
yeah, so
Hi, Dan. It's Anna.
hey, Anna.
I
Hi,
just unmuted myself. Yeah, so,
thank you.
I do realize we did just receive the request to change basically unit measures for 3B and 3E, but some of us have already, worked with our providers to get new contracts going for the new fiscal year. And so it's going to require us to go back to the providers, work with them on adjusting how they want to move from like a contact to a session. And I'm just wondering, can it be delayed for the following fiscal year? Because we're going to need to go back to those providers to renegotiate a contract using the new unit measures. I'm not quite sure why it's happening kind of as late as it
Well,
is.
yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate the question. So the unit measure change or update was, um, and again, for clarifying purposes, it's not necessarily changing how the service is being delivered. It should have already been done in those ways. It's just helping to clarify what that is. So, for example, for health promotion, it should it should have already been done that way, but it's as a session and not as a contact, because so contact is leading to a lot of confusion in terms of counting the number of people as the service unit. That's not a service unit, counting the number of people or contacts. So you see, start to follow, like there's a lot of confusion there. So we change it to session. It should have already been done as session, but because it was listed as contact, it's leading to more confusion. So unit measures being reported and number of people reported are two separate data points. They're not the same thing. They should, in most cases, I'm sure someone can find an exception somewhere, but in most cases, those are different data points. They should not be one and the same between the service unit being delivered and the number of people receiving that service. So the unit, again, we change it to clarify, but it's really not changing at the heart of like, or it's not changing what the service is or what the service unit is. It's just helping to clarify what that service unit is. And please work with the nutrition team too. They're also, of course, very well versed in these updates and these changes too. And we worked with them on these changes. So it's to help to clarify what we have already been trying to communicate to everyone.
Yeah, Dan,
Um,
I'm
yes.
sorry. This is
Yeah, go ahead,
Anna.
Anna.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for clarifying. It's just really more, and I think there's Jana has a question around this
Hmm.
as well, but it's more a process question, because for some of us, we have information included in our contract, and I appreciate and know contacts and sessions may not be as important on your level, but as far as contract, we need to kind of go back and then change and revise contracts to be able to execute them for the new fiscal year. So it just adds more administrative burden. Although I completely get what you mean about the actual activity, but we've always asked the providers to track it that way. And that's what's included in the contracts we're trying to execute with them now. So just as a point of clarification for, I don't know for others, but we have to then pull back,
Yeah.
recontact providers, redo the contracts, although it seems small, to be able to include that new information and also change how they track and also allocate the funds to support those activities.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
just wanted to bring it up, and I'll stop right there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Anna. And yeah, thank you for that. And something else that I'm starting to learn more too. I'm not a contract expert. I'm not a procurement expert. But if I look at our current, like what our contract looks like, or MOU, memorandum of understanding, with a program guide with the AAAs, we don't say what the unit measures are in there. Probably similar for this sort of reason. If we change that, we then have to go change that too. So I think I don't know exactly, it's just something to look into to think about in terms of like, do you need to name the unit measure in there? Is there a requirement somewhere that we need to do that? I don't know, but it's something to look into. And then again, asking AAA colleagues or other AAAs, other PSAs, if they are including the unit measure in there or not, and those sorts of things. So something to look into. Again, that's not contract advice, that's not procurement advice, nothing like that. It's just something to think about and look into if that might be a possibility. Okay, next question. Let's see. Earliest I can post the webinar. Timing, 10 minutes. Sorry. I'll try to have it, seriously, joking aside, thank you, but I'll try to have it, when we're done here, I'll finish it up and have the request to our comms team sometime today. So by the end of the week at the latest, earliest would be tomorrow, earliest would be tonight or tomorrow. So probably within the next few days, if not earlier. Alicia.
Hi, Dan.
Hi.
This is Alicia with PSA 7. My
Hi.
question is kind of going along the lines of what Anna's asking. And I
Sure.
think what I'm understanding you saying is, for example, the 3D unit measure change before it was contacts, right? But you're saying we should have really never have been counting per head,
Correct.
right? So session is now congruent with the same thing. It's just called something different.
Correct.
Okay,
You're following.
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying and checking.
Sure.
Okay. Jan, I see your comments here. Thank you for that. Yeah, a question in there. My chats. I gotta make my chat bigger. Oh, so you do have a question administratively, take us a couple months to implement. I mean, in terms of data reporting, we understand. I mean, that's how we've worked with it with other changes in the past, historically with our team, especially when we make you aware of the change the month before a new fiscal year starts. So yes, as a data team for data collection reporting, yes, we will be flexible with that, but we do expect it to please have it ready as soon as possible. But if you need a quarter or two-ish, whatever that might be, to have that implemented for data collection reporting, that's okay. Just communicate with us, work with us on it. We appreciate that. Don, you had a question about nutrition education?
I did. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah.
So I was just looking at the data dictionary and it says that we're changing it to session. Is that right? Sorry.
Yes.
And so,
contact session. Yes.
yeah.
Go.
And it says a session for C1 is one presentation covering the same topic, even if offered multiple times in multiple locations. So if it's the same topic 6 times, it's just one session.
I believe so. Is someone from the nutrition team on that can also confirm, clarify that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Amanda's here. Hey, Dawn.
Thanks, Amanda.
Hi.
Hi. Yes, so that's correct. So if you're providing, say, a presentation on hypertension and you're providing that same presentation to 10 locations, that's still considered one session, but then you're counting the estimated unduplicated clients from all of those 10 sessions. And so you have two different reporting data points, as Dan mentioned. So there is no change actually to the definition or the service unit definition for nutrition education. We're just providing an example to help clarify because we've had still some confusion on how to report and what the difference is between a session in terms of number of topics that may be provided or being provided to how many locations.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. That makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
I have a second question. So in the data dictionary, it says a session for C2 is one set of handouts covering the same topic. So we're supposed to track the C1 and C2 nutrition education sessions separately,
Correct.
but it's only one line item that we report. Or are they supposed to be two separate lines? Because I don't see, please correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see two separate
In the
Correct.
data
rows.
dictionary, yeah. Did you want to?
Correct. Yeah, so nutrition education will still be reported as as one. It's
One
you'll
set of data.
still correct. So you'll need to internally know what you're doing for C1 and C2. So say
Okay,
the minimum you would be providing say 4 sessions, so one each quarter for C1 and 4 sets of handouts, so one for each quarter for C2. So that would be a total of 8 for the year. You would be reporting it just as one data point. So
one
combining
data
between
point.
C1 and C2. But you need to
Okay,
meet the requirement for nutrition education individually for C1 and C2. Does that make sense?
yes. Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you, Don and Amanda.
Mhm.
Seen anything else in the chat? Hands? See a hand over there. Amy, go ahead, please.
Hey, I just wanted to let you guys know how much we base on the data dictionary, right? So if
Right.
you tell me that a unit of service is a contact, that's what I negotiate with my people, right? So it's like I pay them by number of contacts, not by number of sessions, which what I was told from Linda is oftentimes how many people are in each class, right? So as opposed to the number of classes. So we do have to go back, for us at least, and renegotiate. I mean, like the amount of money doesn't change, but the amount of money that I'm paying them by a certain amount does change significantly. So, I'm also then paying them, if I'm paying them by that session, I mean, there's a big difference. And then if they don't do those sessions or, or do cancel classes, there is a significant less money that they're going to get paid as opposed to the number of people who just don't show up to various classes. So I just want to let you guys know that there are funding implications tied with each of these things that are pretty big. And that then impacts budgets, it impacts contracts, it impacts the whole stuff. And I mean, our contract is small enough that I don't have to do a board letter with it, but any changes oftentimes have to go to the board. So it is a big deal. It's not just a minor thing. And I mean, like, we appreciate changes to the data dictionary, but just know that those changes, like, we make a really big difference. And then
Appreciate that. Thank you for the.
yeah, just know that, and like this is gonna take some time on our end. And I understand that you guys don't necessarily have a lot of change, don't know things ahead of time, but like a lot of us have done all of these things already, and we're, unlike kind of the area plan where we were allowed to say, well, we're just not going to implement these changes because we got the data late. Like we have to do these. So even if the data isn't due right away, like the contract stuff is. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, kind of like the nutrition education units, and I know Missy's on here, when we get not the error report, but the why are things different, the 10% minimum. I
Mhm.
mean, this is going to severely impact that for us as well. We're going to have significantly less units
Put
associated.
write that in your explanation, please.
We will.
Thank
But
you.
just so you're aware, it's
Yes.
a
Thank you.
lot on our end, and it's a burden on our contractors, especially when they're all freaking out, especially with 3D almost getting cut and then not getting cut, and then being like, no, please, we're gonna be okay. And by the way, now you gotta redo
Yeah.
everything. So, our 3D people are especially sensitive right now. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing that. With that, I mean, well, we got 6 more minutes. Any other comments, questions? Or we can all break for lunch.
Not seeing any additional hands or anything in the chat just yet.
Well, I'll start rambling off a closing here, and then if a hand pops up, that's okay. But thank you again, everyone. We do appreciate you being here, showing up, sharing this information with others that might not have been able to make it. Please contact us if you have any questions or information. That's what we're here for. Whether it be me and Missy and Sharon and the data team, or the other program teams as well, please reach out to them. As you saw Amanda here on the nutrition team, answering more specific detailed questions about service delivery for those nutrition services. Please do the same for supportive services, family caregiver, and we all try to work together, of course, the best we can on these things too. So no hands popped up. I think we'll end it here. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Get better, Amy.